This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host Renee Williams. So today in studio we have Rex Mann, and Rex is a retired forester for the U.S. Forest Service. His last duty station was at the Daniel Boone here in Kentucky, and he worked with the Forest Service for 42 years. And he was also a founder of the Kentucky chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation, and he founded that in 2001. And Rex received a Bachelor of Science degree in Forestry from NC State University in 1967. So it's a pleasure to have you in studio today to talk about the American Chestnut.
I'm happy to be here.
Good.
So tell us what drew you to the forestry profession.
First of all, I grew up in the southern Appalachians. My dad was a woodsman. We were always played in the woods. That was my playground when I was growing up. And when I was in high school, we had a career day, and a gentleman from the U.S. Forest Service came in and told about the work he did, and being a sophomore and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I knew from that instant that that was what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. So after 5 years of hard work to get my degree, I went to work for the U.S. Forest Service, and as you mentioned, I did 42 years with that outfit. Love it to this day. Never had any regrets. It was just a great way to spend your life. So I'm very happy with what I did.
And so what first got you interested in the American chestnut?
I grew up hearing chestnut stories. My dad first saw the forest when he was growing up, and he grew up in the mountains of North Carolina before the blight came, and he saw the majesty of the chestnut. He saw the woods dominated by this tree. He was from Appalachian stock, and he really knew what that tree meant to his people. It was very important. For example, these were poor folks, and in the fall of the year, they had no money, and the whole family would go into the forest and pick up sacks full of chestnuts, take them to the country store, where they exchanged them for things they couldn't afford to buy, like shoes for the kids. Those chestnuts eventually were delivered to the big cities by the trainload. And you've heard the song of roasting chestnuts on an open fire. Well, mm-hmm. that's where they went, and they were sold on the city streets for many, many years. But before they got there, they played a role in helping the local mountain people get things that they just simply couldn't afford to buy.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about the history of the American chestnut in the United States.
It was what ecologists call a foundation species for the forest. They played such a powerful role. Probably 25% of all the overstory timber in the forests along the Appalachian chain were American chestnuts, and it grew to a huge size. 10-foot diameter trees were not that unusual in the southern Appalachians, and it reached a height of 100 foot or more. And unlike the other nut-producing trees, the American chestnut produced a bumper crop of seeds every year. It literally dumped bushels of chestnuts onto the forest floor, where the oak trees and the other nut-producing trees are cyclic. They produce real good crops maybe every 2 to 5 years, but the chestnut produced huge quantities of nuts every year. Everything in the forest ate those chestnuts, from blue jays to chipmunks to bear, deer, turkey. And it was just a base for a huge variety, huge numbers of wildlife that also helped sustain our ancestors. So it was a very important tree. The wood was extremely rot resistant. It persisted for many years. In the earliest days of our development, it was heavily used for building houses, for cross ties, for the first telephone poles were made out of American chestnut. And it was just a wonderful wood that really met a lot of the needs of our people.
So can you tell a little bit about what happened and when?
Well, in 1904, chestnuts in New York City began to die and no one knew why. And this was at the Brooklyn Zoological Park. And these huge chestnuts that were growing there began to die. They found out after a while that it was a disease from Asia that was likely brought in on Japanese chestnuts that were brought to this country somewhere in New York to see if they produced more chestnuts for sale. But the blight became established in New York City, and within 40 years, probably 4 billion American chestnuts died from this blight. Well, as I said, my dad witnessed all this happening, and as I was growing up, I heard these stories, and it was just really a tragic thing. The blight did not kill the roots of the tree, so we still have young chestnuts or small chestnuts persisting in the forest today, which helps my group in our efforts to breed up an American chestnut that is resistant to the blight, and we've been working on this for 35 years. But this was the first of a series of tragic events where foreign insects and diseases are brought into this country. Our trees generally have no resistance to these pests, and we're currently losing our hemlock trees and billions of ash trees. So the loss of the chestnut was the first sad story of this episode.
So why is it important to bring the American chestnut back?
We have to think of forests not just as a random collection of trees growing there, but of a well-developed ecosystem that consists of all the life in that forest, the animal life, the trees, the undergrowth, all these species growing together. And when we lose a species, our forests become less resilient, less able to cope with future threats. So from a genetic standpoint, it's terrible to lose a species. And our forests, over the years, have lost a number of species. We're in the process right now of losing more. And the forests, most people don't understand in today's world that this is what sustained our ancestors, and this is what helped develop this wonderful country of ours. It's our forests. And it's a shame, particularly if we have the science and technology which we're developing today, not to bring back something that we're losing. But in the history of mankind, we've never yet brought back a tree that we've lost. So American chestnut will likely be the first species that we're bringing back.
So tell us a little bit about your work with the American Chestnut Foundation and how they're working to bring it back. What are some of their efforts and what it's being done?
Well, we're pursuing a number of different courses. And most of our effort over the past 35 years, and the American Chestnut Foundation, there is a website that we can post, that folks can access, but we've been in business for about 35 years, and for the large part of that time we have devoted our efforts to a breeding program, somewhat complicated The Asian trees that were the source of the disease, the blight, over eons have developed a resistance to the blight. The blight originated in Asia, and the Asian trees have some measure of resistance to the blight. So we have been and are continuing to work on a breeding program where we cross the American chestnut with the Asian trees, cross them back to a pure American tree, with the idea that all we want from the Asian tree is the few genes that convey blight resistance to that tree, and incorporate those into the American tree. Now, to be truthful, within the past year or so, we found that this approach is likely much more complex than what we originally thought when we began the program. We have discovered with the new technology that there are a number of genes, possibly 8 or 9, that affect that resistance in the Asian tree. We were using the approach, it was the best science at the time, that there were probably 2, possibly 3 genes that conveyed that resistance. We now know there are more. So right now we are continuing to work on the tree that we're developing. It has some resistance. We're going to be doing testing to see if this tree is good enough to compete and fulfill the role of the original American chestnut tree. Now, at the same time, we're using a couple of other approaches. One that is somewhat controversial in some circles, and that is a New York chapter has worked for several decades to develop a genetically modified tree. They have produced this tree. It appears to be resistant to the blight. It now is going through approval by our federal government, the Department of Agriculture, the EPA, and the Food and Drug Administration, because chestnut is a food crop, are all involved in this approval process. It may very well be approved for distribution within the next couple of years. The other approach that we continue to follow, without getting too deep into the science here, when the blight, the disease, entered Europe, and it came to Europe from the United States, there are European chestnut trees also. These trees began to die, and then after a period of time, they noticed that these trees were recovering. To make a long story short, they discovered that the blight, which is a fungus, it's a fungal disease, was infected with a virus. And this virus made the disease much less lethal. It did not kill the trees. So they began to recover. And today, most of the chestnuts are still alive in Europe. Somehow this, we call this Hypo Virulence, this condition of a virus invading a fungus and making it less damaging. It spreads easily, it appears to, in Europe. We have not been able to this point to obtain that dispersion, to get the hypovirulence to spread in North America. We can put it into a single tree, but we haven't yet figured out how to get this new species of blight, if you will, to spread to other trees and get the same results that we saw in Europe where the trees recovered. But we're still working on it. So we have 3 approaches that we're using. The traditional tree breeding program, which is roughly the same process we use for our food crops, for corn, wheat. We have the genetically modified tree that is in the process of being approved by our federal government, and our scientists are still working on the hypovirulence, which saved the chestnut in Europe. We likely will end up using a combination of all these efforts in our work to bring the chestnut back.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
So there's other types of chestnut trees as well, right?
Yes, there are. There are at least 4 or 5 species growing in China. There is a Japanese chestnut, which was the source of the original fungus that entered our country. There is the European chestnut, and then there is the American chestnut tree. We need to say that the chestnut trees, really both in Europe and in Asia, were grown, developed for thousands of years to be orchard trees. They were most interested in the production of nuts. So these trees generally, unlike the North American chestnut, the American chestnut, which grew straight and tall, the thing was probably the fastest growing hardwood in our eastern forests. And on good sites, it easily could reach 100 feet in height and huge diameter. But it grew like gangbusters to get up into the main canopy, whereas the Asian trees and the European trees simply can't compete in our forests. They have a lower growth habit. They branch earlier, and they were developed as orchard trees.
Is there an easy way to explain how you're making the American chestnut resistant to this fungus? How you even accomplish that without, getting too scientific?
Well, that's a good question. We see the same thing being repeated in other diseases that are entering our country. See, our forests, a lot of these diseases arose in Asia or other parts of the world. North America was protected by an ocean on either side. Mm-hmm. So North and South America. So there were very few of these diseases or insects that found their way to our shores. So there was no need for our trees to develop a resistance to them. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Asia, the blight first began there, and so for thousands, perhaps millions of years, those trees have evolved. They have, it's like a competition. The tree gets a little better at resisting the blight, so the blight evolves to have perhaps another tool to attack the tree in a different way. And all that has gone on for ages, and our forests, because of their isolation, simply did not have to do that. And so, as a general rule, when one of these invasive diseases or insects come here, our trees have little or no resistance to them. But the science can get very complex. For example, this genetically modified tree that is being worked on. What they did here was take one gene from a wheat plant, and I have to explain how this works. When the blight, which is a fungus, has tiny spores, they enter through a wound in the tree, some openings where the blight fungus gets inside the bark. It begins to grow. It happens to be a type of fungus that prefers dead wood, so it puts out an acid called oxalic acid. The fungus does that kills the tissue of the tree. Certain plants, including the wheat plant, the banana tree, it's fairly common in nature, have this gene that shuts off or neutralizes oxalic acid. So they took one gene from a wheat plant. We call it the OXO, the oxalic acid oxidate. it's inserted into the genome of the tree. When that acid begins to be produced by the blight, by the fungus, this gene kicks in and it neutralizes the oxalic acid. It changes it into hydrogen peroxide and oxygen. This is not a simple explanation.
I'm sorry.
But it stops the fungus from killing the tree. It does not kill the fungus. The fungus is still there, but it's an irritation instead of a death threat at that time. So the tree is able to grow. But again, this is one gene. The tree genetically is 99.999 pure American chestnut.
Mm-hmm.
In our breeding program that we're pursuing, we were crossing an Asian tree with an American tree. They cross easily. We take that offspring, which is 50% American chestnut, 50% Asian, cross it back to a pure American. Mm-hmm. And we do that repeatedly, 3 times. It's a bit more complex than this, but we are shooting to end up with a tree that is about 94% American genetically and about 6% Chinese. So, but it would contain the genes from the Asian tree that would make it resistant to the blight. We're still working on that. We've hit a roadblock or two, but we're still working to continue that process.
I think you explained that really well. Yeah. I appreciate that. Thank you.
So tell us about some of the work that you're doing here with the University of Kentucky Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. I know you've been working on some of this research, and
we have. I've got the advantage that I've been in Kentucky for about 30 years, so I know many of the people who are here. And over the years, they have been tremendous help to me in my career with the Forest Service. We now have an intern from University of Kentucky that is working with us. His mentor here at school is Dr. Ellen Crocker, who was instrumental in developing the Tree Snap app that goes on our smartphones, with which anybody who finds an American chestnut still in the forest, and there are many of them out there. We're very interested in finding these trees, but this Tree Snap app gives us the ability to take a photo of that little tree. It puts the coordinates of where the tree is located. There's a few simple questions that people can answer. But it's a long partnership, and we're very happy to have the support of University of Kentucky in this effort to do something never before done in history, and that is bring back a tree. And not just a tree, but a foundation tree for our forests here in Kentucky.
So how can people tell American chestnut tree from the other chestnuts you were talking about, the chestnut trees?
Well, it's not simple. And again, we have a website that will go into details. The leaves are somewhat different. The American chestnut has a distinctive leaf shape. There are certain things that foresters deal with, like there's a little bit of fuzz or hair on the back of the Asian trees that is not there on the American trees. The buds look different. The color of the stem is different, and all these are explained in a website that that people can access. Sometimes, because they cross easily, some of the hybrids are very difficult, and it takes an expert to really determine what is this tree. Is it pure American, or is it a hybrid of perhaps an Asian tree and the American tree, or a European tree? And but there is a process where we encourage people to send perhaps one of the leaves or in a part of the stem to us, and we'll be happy to look at the tree and determine what it is.
Mm-hmm. And we can provide a link on our website for that.
Sure.
So that's good.
Now, the casing that goes around the nut, what do you all call that? And
It's the burr.
It's the burr.
It
It's
is.
pretty prickly,
Yes,
yeah.
it is. It's a funny thing. I've heard my dad, again, who grew up as a child in the Appalachians, and in those days, most people went barefoot when you were kids, and I've heard him tell stories of their feet would get so tough that they could actually stomp these things.
Oh my.
And open up the chestnut burr. But the chestnut does have this really threatening burr that the three chestnuts are encased in. It protects the nut as it's developing. But as a general rule, when the chestnuts become ripe, quite often this burr will open on the tree and dump the chestnuts on the ground. Or if it does fall, it'll open up, and you can, with a little bit of care, not to get your fingers full of stickers, you can get the chestnuts out of the burr. But it's just a way of protecting the young nut to keep it from being eaten before it's ready. So,
you know, when I was growing up, there was one right around the corner. It was across a creek, and they would drop on the road, and you would take your shoes and your feet and split open it, and then grab the chestnuts. Yeah, I don't know which kind of chestnut tree it was. But.
It's funny, even in spite of that negative aspect right there, there's hardly a town in the United States that does not have a chestnut street. Mm-hmm. You know, almost every town has at least one chestnut street. People, even with the burrs falling in their yards, they love to have these things growing in their backyard because they were such a source of food, not only for them, but for wildlife. Mm-hmm. They were a beautiful tree. There's no question.
And I've noticed that it seems like the chestnut are coming back into grocery stores too. Like this last year, there were some in grocery stores.
Yeah, those are European chestnuts as a general rule. And again, the history of this, it was a big deal at the turn of the last century, and for many, many years. The American chestnut, which is the sweetest, best tasting chestnut of any of its relatives, either the European or the Asian chestnuts. The American chestnut had the best flavor. It was smaller, but it really had a delicious flavor. Very few of those are being produced. The largest chestnut trees in the country are grown on the West Coast. And this is because early settlers so prized that tree that they carried some chestnuts with them when they crossed the Great Plains and went to the West Coast. And they planted them in Washington, Oregon, other northwestern states. Because the blight has never gotten there, some of these trees have become quite large, and they're producing chestnuts. But if they're exposed to the blight, it'll kill them. Because as far as we know, the American tree had no resistance to the blight. They do grow in some places on the West Coast, taken there by early settlers in the last century.
So one thing I know about chestnuts too, just eating them, if you leave them too long, there'll be a worm that'll come through.
Yes, there is.
So let's explain that a little bit.
Well, it's a little weevil that I think it actually gets in the flower of the tree when they're. But the amazing thing about it is the nut matures, if you keep it for a long time, if it has this little egg from the weevil in there, yes, it will. If you're eating that chestnut before it develops, there is no bad taste. It is a wonderful tasting chestnut, and so the secret is to eat that thing pretty quickly after it comes off the tree. But I don't know of any feasible way that you could prevent that happening in the forest. So, but it's there. It is. Mm-hmm. It's a part of the whether every nut is infected with it, I'm not sure, but a good many can be, for sure.
And I was wondering too, is there a trick to peeling the nuts?
I have to confess that I don't have a long history of preparing these chestnuts, roasting them. Or when I was growing up, my dad would talk about them, and a lot of times they boiled the chestnuts, rather than roasted them. But if you there is a trick if you're roasting chestnuts to take a sharp knife or tool and cut a little cross on the top of the chestnut to begin to split the nut, and then after it roasts, it opens up. If you can do that, makes it a bit easier to eat.
Yeah.
You mentioned they were very tall trees. How long did it take to get kind of to that full-grown height?
Well, again, and this is forestry stuff right here. The chestnut has the amazing ability. First of all, chestnuts were so desired by every kind of wildlife that under a chestnut stand, if you will, when the chestnut dumped its nuts out on the ground, every creature in the forest came after them. And two animals we can talk about store chestnuts for winter, just like they do acorns. The squirrels, all types of squirrels and chipmunks actually store these chestnuts. The other bird that does this is the blue jay. And they would harvest the chestnuts from the top of the tree, fly off to an area removed from the tree, and actually plant each one of these, bury these chestnuts in the soil. During the wintertime, they go back and find these chestnuts, but they don't get them all. And so if a tree is producing nuts, the blue jay is probably one of the best tree planters in our universe, because they take these chestnuts, they eat most of them during the wintertime, go back and dig them up, but a few would not be eaten, and these would develop into small seedlings. Those seedlings had the ability, they're very tolerant of shade, and they can sit there for decades, just almost no growth, just surviving. Then when a tree that's shading this young chestnut perhaps dies or something happens to it, a fire or a windstorm creates an opening in the tree, that tiny little seedling begins to grow faster than any other species probably that grows in our woods. Grows very rapidly to get into the crown of the tree, and once it's there, it was not unusual for the chestnut tree to live for centuries. They could live to be 200 or 300 years old and get a huge size. But they're well suited to survive in the shade. They just don't flower. They just sit there. But when an opening is created, man, they take off, and they make it very quickly. They can outgrow almost any other species, probably even yellow poplar, which is a very fast-growing tree in our country. But the chestnut had the ability to get up to the main canopy very quickly and win that foot race. Sadly, today, because the blight is still here, it has alternate hosts in some of our oak trees. It doesn't kill the oak trees, but the blight persists and is able to reproduce, so it'll always be here. That's why we have to produce trees that are resistant to these diseases or insects that are coming in. So in today's world, if there's a young chestnut in the shade, growing in the shade or surviving in the shade, an opening occurs and it begins to grow. When it gets about an inch or two in diameter, the blight, which is still here, affects that tree and kills it back to the ground, where it sprouts again, but probably has to sit there for a long, long time, waiting on another opportunity.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
Most of these pests, diseases or insects that come into our country are usually here to stay. They find alternate hosts to survive. So The only feasible way to bring back a tree under these conditions is to develop one that has the ability to resist that pest. And the only way we can do that in today's world is to intervene and use the extremely rapidly developing science and technology in genetics and the techniques that go with forestry. We have to use those skills to develop trees that can survive. That's the name of the game.
Mm-hmm. So if someone found a seed and wanted to plant it, it would probably just
It would.
die after.
Yeah, sadly it would. We even the trees that we've worked so hard on in our breeding program, at this point, not all of them have the genes that would make the tree resistant. And to really restore this tree, we can't end up with one that has the branching habit of the other chestnuts found around the world. We have to have this tree that can perform the same role as the original American chestnut, that has the ability to grow rapidly and live for a long time and withstand the blight. That's what we're shooting for.
And they're the ones that actually, you said, had more chestnuts than the rest of them too. So are you aiming for that as well?
Well, yes, we do. As we select for these trees, we have several requirements. Number one, we need the tree that has the growth habit, the rapid growth, the ability to live for a long, long period of time. But we're also looking for the tree that will do as the American chestnut did and produce bumper crops of chestnuts every year for our wildlife. And that's extremely important to not just restore a chestnut tree, but we need to bring back that tree that dominated our forests for thousands of years.
One thing I wanted to ask, if you had, we've talked a lot about the importance of this tree, and I know you have a lot of family history. Is there a story that you would like to share? Maybe one of your father's favorite stories about the chestnut, or something that you want to share with our listeners, just to kind of put them in place of how things might have been like?
I would, and this is a true story. In my career with the Forest Service, I worked all over the South in many, many locations, but coming with strong family ties, my wife and I managed to, twice a year, during the summer for a short vacation and at Christmas time, we would load our kids up, no matter where we lived, and drive back to western North Carolina. And my dad, who was an old mountain man, loved to take those kids to the forest. And even in the wintertime, we would go and build up a big fire. And my dad, who was a master storyteller, would tell these stories about how it was when he was growing up, how the forest was, how the wildlife was, because he loved it. But the loss of the chestnut had such an impact on him that the only time that I ever saw a tear in his eyes was as he sat around the campground with my two boys and nephews, and he would tell about the loss of the chestnut and what it meant to his people, and I would see a tear sliding down his old face, and at that time it just really, he more than most folks knew what we had lost, and he spent his life trying, just hopeful that something would come up, some way that we could restore the tree. And sadly he died before we got to the point where we are now. And in my mind, I'm an optimist. I absolutely believe this tree will be restored. But to bring it back, I emphasize again, we have to intervene. We have almost overwhelmed our forests with this huge invasion of foreign insects and diseases that have come in mostly through world trade. None of this was intentional. No one wanted to bring in diseases that would eliminate our native trees, but it's happened. And I think we have overwhelmed our forests to the point where if we don't intervene, we're going to continue to lose species after species with disastrous results. So if there ever was a time to rely on the science that we have worked so hard in this country at places like University of Kentucky to develop, if we don't use that, there's going to be disastrous results, in my opinion.
Well, I was going to ask you if you had a takeaway point for our listeners, but that kind of sounded like it was it. But if you have another one, please let us know.
Well, the only other thing that I would say is in the annals of history, never ever have we brought back a tree. We have done amazing work with our food crops, producing more food, helping to feed the world. We can use that same technology today to bring back the trees that we've lost. And what a gift for our grandkids and those that come after us. I think it would be almost criminal if we don't do that. So I guess that's a takeaway I'd like to leave.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you'd like more information on what you heard today, please visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
That was a familiar sound.
It is. It's one that basically, if you live almost anywhere in North America, well, I shouldn't say that, anywhere in America, and have a front porch,
Right.
you could probably walk out and look up and see their nest sitting in the corner, and it's a mourning dove.
Mm-hmm.
They're one of our most abundant migratory game birds.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we're talking about them right now is actually dove season is the official start of most wildlife hunting in many of our states. September 1st is when almost all the states have their first opening dove hunt.
Oh, okay. So I guess there's a lot of them.
There is a lot of them estimated right now for mourning doves alone, and they're not our only dove species we have in North America. We have several other species down in Texas, and we actually have an invasive species in Kentucky, the Eurasian collared dove. But globally, the mourning dove is estimated at 120 million birds.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, so there's a lot of them, and there's a reason why there's a lot of them, is because they can have upwards of 6 different broods each year. They produce,
how many in each?
They produce 2 young, usually in each brood. It only takes them about, from start to finish, about a month before from they start sitting on those eggs until that bird is walking out of that and flying out of that nest.
Hence the big numbers.
It's a quick turnaround, and their ability to have 6 different nests a year, it's a very quick turnaround. And you know, they're one that even with hunting, there's about 20 million doves shot annually hunting, so it's quite a bit. But because their reproduction is so high, they can handle it.
Okay. So what kind of nests do they build?
They'll build little stick nests, and they'll pick porches. Sometimes they're on the ground in rare cases, but mostly in trees. Between forks of the limbs and brush. They're a generalistic nester for the most part. They're not really specific. So they'll kind of be all over the place.
Are they pretty much all the same colors?
The doves? Yes, they're all kind of that grayish with a little bit of purple hinting on the feathers if they get the sun just right.
Right. I know my great-grandmother used to call them rain crows.
Interesting. I've never heard that. We're going to have to add that to the future nickname show.
They said the only time they would hear them is what they said was when it was getting ready to rain.
Interesting. I have not heard that. So one of the things that we all know, that coo sound that they make, they actually tied that to breeding propensity. So the more the male sings, the more likely he is to get that female to re-nest.
Okay.
So the more vocal the male, the more likely he is to have more young.
Okay.
So there's an advantage to that.
Now, what's the difference between a dove and a pigeon?
So they're all related. Pigeon is so a pigeon is actually officially now called a rock dove.
Oh, okay.
And there's domesticated lines of pigeons, just like there's a domesticated line of doves. But our rock doves are actually native to Europe. So that's why we see them a lot with human buildings and disturbances, is that's kind of where they fit in. We do have a native pigeon down in Florida. However, they're just a slightly larger relative to the dove.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming in and talking about them.
No problem.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on anything you've heard, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.